Today, we slip into London, 1888, a city choking on fog and coal smoke, where gas lamps burn weak against alleys that reek of gin, blood, and despair. In Buck's Row, the first light of dawn falls on a woman's body. Her throat, slashed so deep it seems silence itself, has been cut open. By night's end, the press will call her a prostitute, the police will call her a victim, but the killer will call her nothing at all. And from that silence rises a name the world will never forget: Jack the Ripper. Not caught, not unmasked, not even certain to be real. Yet his shadow still clings to London's bricks, as if the city itself remembers. It starts with a scream no one hears. A butcher sharpening his blade in Whitechapel swears he saw a figure stumble into the fog, blood dripping like ink onto cobblestones. But the next morning, the newspapers describe something far worse than a drunken brawl. Body of a woman found in Buck's Row, throat cut from ear to ear, abdomen mutilated. The words are clinical, almost bored. Victorian journalism had a knack for sounding like a grocery list even when describing carnage. But behind those cold lines hides a scene of intimate horror. Ann Nichols, face frozen in a final, confused gasp, eyes wide at the gas lamp glow. Her life ended in an alley no wider than a carriage. What chills isn't just the violence, it's the efficiency. The killer worked as if time been around him. Police reports whisper of incisions too clean for chance, a blade that didn't hesitate, and a darkness that seemed to shield him. Nichols was poor, yes. A sex worker, yes. Disposable to Victorian society, absolutely. But when her body was found, a new terror seeped into London's bones. This wasn't a quarrel gone wrong. This was ritual, calculation, a hunter's calling card. Imagine being the constable who stumbled onto that corpse in the half-light of dawn, horses pulling milk carts clattering in the distance, while the woman at your feet looked more butchered animal than human. Her skirt pulled up, her dignity stolen. Her death the first drumbeat in what would soon be an orchestra of fear. And yet, the city marched on, carriages rattling down Whitechapel Road as if murder was just another stain on the pavement. This wasn't the polite poisonings of Victorian drawing rooms, nor the quiet asphyxiations hidden in family estates. No, this was murderous theater. The stage, London's labyrinth of alleys. The audience, an empire on edge. The actor, a phantom wielding a knife so sharp it could split both flesh and history. And London, that bloated beast of industry and empire, had no idea it had just given birth to a new myth, one that smelled of gin, sweat, and blood. London in the late 1800s was not the city of postcards and polite afternoon teas. It was a beast, swollen with industry, belching smoke into skies that never cleared, a city of empire, where riches glittered in Mayfair mansions, while children starved in East End gutters. Picture it. Horse dung steaming on cobblestones, gas lamps sputtering in the fog, entire families crammed into single damp rooms that stank of sweat and mildew. The smell of cheap gin bled into the air, mixing with cold dust, fried eels, and the iron tang of the slaughterhouses. The city was obsessed with progress, railroads, factories, telegraphs, yet progress had left whole districts behind. Whitechapel was a gaping wound of the metropolis, a dumping ground of forgotten, the homeless, the working poor. It was here that the casual ward system turned human desperation into a grotesque lottery. Queue all night, and maybe you get a bed of straw and a watery bowl of gruel. If not, sleep on the streets, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper, while rats gnawed at your boots. Respectable Londoners pretended not to see it. They took their carriages through Whitechapel like tourists on safari, peering out at the dangerous classes, a phrase that made poverty sound like a contagious disease. The police, underpaid and overstretched, patrolled with truncheons that felt like toys against the rising tide of crime. Brothels disguised as lodging houses sprouted like mushrooms, while gin shops sold ruin for a penny a glass. And into this festering landscape came paranoia, fueled by gothic novels, penny dreadfuls, and the public's secret hunger for scandal. Ghost stories walk the streets as surely as drunks did. People whisper about body snatchers prowling graveyards, about surgeons who bought corpses for experiments, about men with foreign accents who slit throats in the dark. Science was advancing. Yes, electric light, chloroform, X-rays were looming on the horizon, but science was also terrifying. If doctors could cut open a human body and rearrange it like clockwork, then what kind of monster could do the same on a whim in a filthy Whitechapel alley? The Victorian era loved its dualities. Gentlemen in top hats reciting scripture by day, then slipping into brothels by night. A queen who ruled an empire with stern moral codes, while child labor kept her factories humming. It was an age of invention and hypocrisy, of charity sermons delivered in neighborhoods drowning in starvation. This was the backdrop against which terror unfolded. Not in the leafy suburbs or the glittering West End, but in streets so narrow 2 carriages could barely pass, where shadows lasted longer than daylight, and every echo sounded like a warning. Whitechapel was the theater, the smog the curtain, and the actors, poor women who lived hard, died brutally, and were written about with a detachment reserved for livestock. London in the 1880s wasn't just a city. It was a machine, grinding people down to bone and gristle, and sometimes something darker decided to sharpen its knives in the gears. Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, Mary Jane Kelly. Their names feel like a grim litany, chanted in dim rooms by people who barely remember the faces. 5 women, reduced to shorthand, the canonical victims. But strip away the true crime trivia and you'll find they weren't shadows or statistics. They were flesh and breath, each with a story that stretched far beyond a Whitechapel alley. Take Ann Nichols, Polly, to those who knew her. She once had a husband, children, a life tethered to the fragile respectability expected of Victorian women. But poverty gnawed at her like a rat that never stopped chewing. Marriage dissolved. The workhouse swallowed her. Gin numbed her. When they found her in Buck's Row, her pockets contained nothing but a comb, a handkerchief, and a scrap of broken mirror. That's not just an inventory. It's a tragic biography. Annie Chapman, Dark Annie, carried the weight of illness, alcoholism, and loss. She sold flowers once, bright blooms meant to cheer wealthier households. By the time of her death, she was selling herself for a few pence, coughing blood between negotiations. Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant, carried secrets with her accent. Catherine Eddowes, fiery and defiant, once sang ballads in the streets to earn pennies. And Mary Jane Kelly, youngest, most mysterious, had a beauty that people remembered even to the fog of her mutilation. Some said she came from Ireland, others from Wales. Still others whispered of Paris. She may have been 25. She may have been 30. She may have been someone's daughter, someone's sister. But history remembers her as entrails on a mattress. And here's the most obscene part. These women weren't extraordinary. They were painfully ordinary. They were what happens when society discards you, when the safety nets collapse, when the empire prefers to polish its crown rather than feed its poor. They drifted in and out of lodging houses, scraping coins together for beds. If you couldn't afford a night indoors, you slept rough on the streets, in alleys, in doorways. That's what they had in common. Not sin, not vice, but poverty. Victorian moralists loved to call them fallen women. Fallen from where exactly? They weren't angels who suddenly plunged into degradation. They were human beings shoved, inch by inch, off society's ladder until the ground rose up to meet them. And when death came, the press turned their suffering into cheap entertainment. These women weren't chosen because they were weak. They were chosen because they were visible yet invisible, on display in the streets, ignored in the records. Easy prey, disposable prey. Their killer knew the world wouldn't rally for them. And the tragedy is that he was right. It was August 31st, 1888, when the city's illusions cracked. Dawn broke like a rotten egg over Buck's Row, that narrow strip of cobblestone hemmed in by warehouses and stable yards, where shadows lingered longer than they should. A carman named Charles Cross stumbled across what he thought was just another drunk sprawled on the ground. Nothing unusual in Whitechapel. Human wreckage was everywhere, but as he stepped closer, lantern flickering in his hand, the sight rearranged itself into something unspeakable. Mary Ann Nichols, Polly, lay still. Her skirts were raised indecently, her throat slashed so deep it looked almost surgical, and her abdomen open in a way no accident or drunken fall could explain. Blood soaked into the cobblestones, still tacky enough to catch the light. The first response wasn't horror. It was bureaucracy. The constables who arrived fretted over disturbing the crime scene, yet they propped her body up like discarded furniture until a cart came to haul her away. Neighbors, roused by whispers, peered from their windows with that ghoulish mix of fear and curiosity that crime always stirs. And by breakfast time, the gossip had already mutated. Some said she'd been robbed, others claimed her entrails were missing. Rumors bloomed faster than facts. But one fact was undeniable. This wasn't random violence. Someone had chosen the spot, chosen the victim, and worked with precision under cover of darkness. The wounds were the message, and whether the killer meant it or not, that message traveled like wildfire. By noon, word of the murder was in every gin shop. By nightfall, it was splashed across the pages of the evening papers. Nichols wasn't a woman anymore. She was a Whitechapel horror, a symbol, a headline, a warning that something malignant stalked the streets. In a city where death was common, disease, hunger, industrial accidents, the Nichols murder still landed like a hammer blow. Why? Because it didn't feel inevitable. It felt staged, executed, purposeful. Londoners could accept cholera, they could accept starvation. But this was different. This was a human hand carving fear into the city's flesh. And the killer wasn't done. He was just clearing his throat. The murder of Polly Nichols was a pebble that set the avalanche in motion, tumbling through Whitechapel until the whole of Victorian London found itself buried in dread. The press would call him a fiend, a monster, a phantom. But that first morning in the gray chill of Bucks Row, he was simply absent. A man who walked away unseen, leaving only mutilation behind. The disturbance wasn't just in the body left behind. It was in the realization that London had a new predator, and no one had the faintest idea how to stop him. By the time Annie Chapman's body was found on September 8th, Whitechapel had already started to twitch like a nerve exposed. Nichols' death could have been dismissed as a one-off horror, the work of some drunken brute. But Chapman's murder? It was worse, sharper, more deliberate. She was discovered in the yard of 29 Hanbury Street. Throat cut so deep her head nearly toppled, her abdomen eviscerated with the same obscene confidence as Polly's. And something more chilling, her uterus missing. The rumors metastasized. The killer wasn't just slaughtering, he was harvesting. Surgeons and medical students suddenly found themselves eyed with suspicion. Some newspapers declared it must be a man of anatomical knowledge, someone who knew exactly where to cut. Others whispered about occult rituals, devil worshippers, Freemasons. It didn't matter if the theories contradicted each other. The point was that no one felt safe anymore. And then came the letters. The first was signed Jack the Ripper. Was it really the killer, or some newsroom prankster cashing in on panic? Who cared? The name stuck, branded into the public imagination like a hot iron. Suddenly the murders had an author, a personality, a signature. The killings weren't just crimes. They were a serialized nightmare, each installment delivered in blood and ink. By the end of September, the horror doubled. 2 women killed in one night, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Stride's body suggested the killer had been interrupted. Her wounds were less grotesque, almost hurried. But Eddowes? She was torn apart with such ferocity that even seasoned police officers vomited at the scene. Her face mutilated, her organs taken, her remains left like an exhibit. The Ripper had been evolving, growing bolder, perfecting his art. London responded like a paranoid theater audience. Respectable men refused to let their wives walk the streets after dark. Lodging houses filled with whispers. Everyone suspected everyone else. Butchers, barbers, surgeons, sailors. Anyone with a knife was guilty in the court of public opinion. The police flailed, promising increased patrols, while failing to catch a phantom who seemed to glide to the fog untouched. They had eyewitnesses, shadowy figures, vague recollections, contradictory timelines. A man in a peaked cap, a man with a mustache, a man smoking a pipe. Too many men, too many maybes. And in every alley, the same lingering question, why these women? Why here? Was it revenge? Madness? Or something colder? An experiment in fear, a campaign to prove how fragile the mighty empire really was? With each corpse, the mystery deepened. What began as a murder investigation had become a psychological siege. Whitechapel wasn't just living in fear. It was feeding on it, and the Ripper was dining alongside them, invisible and amused. The investigation was a circus without a ringmaster. Scotland Yard was scrambling, and the press knew it. Detectives combed the alleys of Whitechapel with lanterns, notebooks, and the air of men who already understood they were chasing smoke. They rounded up suspects by the dozen. Drunks, foreigners, men with bloody aprons, men who lived alone, men who dared look suspicious in the wrong gaslight. Most were released within hours. The city demanded answers, but the answers slipped through fingers like soot. Theories bred like vermin. Some swore the killer was a butcher or a slaughterhouse worker, the cuts too clean, the speed too precise. Others insisted on a doctor, a man trained in anatomy. Surgeons winced at the suggestion, already vilified in penny dreadfuls as ghouls who sliced corpses under flickering lamps. Was it coincidence that body snatching and dissection had become public nightmares only a few decades earlier? Or was the Ripper an echo of that fear, walking into the streets with a knife in his fist? Conspiracies piled higher than the smoke from the chimneys. A cabal of Freemasons covering up ritual killings. A Polish immigrant driven by madness. A member of the royal family. Silencing inconvenient witnesses. Some even whisper about a woman, Jill the Ripper. A midwife who could walk the streets drenched in blood without a second glance. Each theory satisfied a hunger, to name the monster, to make him finite, to place a mask on the faceless. And then there were the letters. Hundreds poured in, most obvious hoaxes written in ink still wet with attention-seeking desperation. But a few stood out. Dear Boss, one began, gleefully mocking the police, signed with the now infamous flourish. Jack the Ripper. Whether authentic or not, it was brilliant propaganda. It turned a string of murders into serialized terror, a brand stamped and read across London's psyche. Suddenly the killer wasn't just a man. He was a myth writing his own headlines. Investigators disagreed over everything. Was he left-handed or right? Local or outsider? Insane or terrifyingly sane? They analyzed footprints, bloodstains, even chalk graffiti scrawled near one murder scene. The Jews are men that will not be blamed for nothing. The police, fearing riots against Jewish immigrants, erased it almost immediately. Evidence destroyed, theories multiplied. The truth is this: the investigation wasn't just about a killer. It was about a city unraveling. Scotland Yard fought not only against a phantom, but against time, pressure, prejudice, and a public that demanded daily reassurance yet found comfort in the panic. Every constable with a notebook became a performer in a grotesque theater where failure was guaranteed and the killer, whoever he was, applauded from the wings. London wasn't just hunting the Ripper. It was inventing him, sculpting him from rumor, fear, and its own reflection in the fog. The autumn of 1888 was a city on the edge of a breakdown. When Mary Jane Kelly's body was found on November 9th, the nightmare reached its crescendo. Unlike the previous victims, Kelly was killed indoors, in her small room at Miller's Court. The walls, the bed, the very air seemed painted with gore. Her body wasn't just mutilated, it was annihilated, stripped of organs, her face hacked into something barely human. Even hardened detectives staggered out of that room, gasping, some weeping. The Ripper hadn't killed her. He had performed an autopsy of madness, one so intimate it felt like he'd torn open the soul of the city itself. This was the breaking point. Panic became hysteria. Ordinary murders happened all the time in London, but this was obscene art. It mocked the very idea of order. If the Ripper could slip through the cracks so easily, what faith could anyone have in the men in uniform, in the Queen on her throne, in the Empire itself? Londoners were less afraid of the killer than they were the void he represented. The proof that beneath the cobblestones and carriages, the Empire was made of rot. The police collapsed under the pressure. Detectives bickered, resigned, or drank themselves into stupors. Commissioner Sir Charles Warren quit, humiliated by his inability to stop the killings. Scotland Yard became a revolving door of scapegoats. Each failure added fuel to the fire. Maybe the police didn't want to catch him. Maybe he was one of their own. Maybe he was too powerful to touch. The theories became less about solving crimes and more about explaining away helplessness. The newspapers, smelling blood almost as strongly as the Ripper himself, escalated the frenzy. Headlines shrieked about incompetence, corruption, conspiracies. Cartoons depicted constables asleep in the gutter while the killer prowled overhead. The press wasn't just reporting anymore. It was collaborating, magnifying the killer's shadow until it towered over the city like a demon. Every night Londoners read about their own doom, then locked their doors against it. And beneath the hysteria, something quieter broke: trust. People stopped believing that the world could be managed, that evil could be contained. When a maniac stalks your alleys, carving bodies with impunity, the lie of safety evaporates. Mary Jane Kelly's murder wasn't just a Ripper's climax. It was London's unraveling. The killer didn't need to strike again. He had already won. He had turned the Empire's proudest city into a haunted house. The breakdown wasn't his. It was everyone else's. After Mary Jane Kelly, the killing stopped, or seemed to. No more mutilated bodies in alleys. No more entrails draped like grotesque signatures. The silence should have been comforting, but instead it was worse. Because what's more terrifying than a monster you can't stop? A monster that simply decides to vanish. Did the Ripper die? Was he in prison for some other crime? Did he board a ship and export his butchery elsewhere, turning other cities into laboratories of fear? Or did he simply put down the knife, satisfied with the chaos he carved into history? The police declared the Autumn of Terror over, but their triumph was hollow. They had no suspect to parade, no trial, no confession. Only theories stacked like corpses in a morgue. Montague Druitt, the barrister found drowned in the Thames, was named by some as a killer. Others favored Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish immigrant plagued by mental illness, or Michael Ostrog, a con man with surgical pretensions. Each theory fit, and each theory fell apart under scrutiny. Too many contradictions, too many gaps. And then there's the problem of the letters. Were they genuine communications from the killer, or the fevered scrawls of attention seekers and journalists looking to sell papers? The infamous From Hell letter, sent with half a human kidney, seems convincing. Yet even that is contested. Was it a prank, or the one authentic voice of the Ripper himself? The fact that we still don't know tells you everything about how fractured the evidence was from the beginning. The lingering questions multiply like mold in the damp London air. Why did the Ripper target these women and not others? Was he motivated by hatred, lust, surgical obsession, or some deranged personal crusade? Was he local, blending back into Whitechapel with the ease of familiarity, or an outsider who vanished once his work was complete? And the greatest question of all, how did he escape? Not escape capture. That's almost expected in the fog-choked chaos of Victorian policing. But how did he escape memory? Not the myth. Oh, the myth thrived, but the man himself. No one ever identified him with certainty. He remained a silhouette cast against brick walls, a whisper fading into smoke. The case didn't end. It evaporated, leaving only dread in its place. And perhaps that was the killer's final masterpiece. ensuring that no resolution was possible, that London would forever gnaw on the bone of uncertainty, starving for answers that never came. The murders stopped, but the questions kept breathing. And they still do. The murders may have ended, but the echo never did. Whitechapel, once merely poor and filthy, became synonymous with horror. Women walked faster, clutching shawls tighter. Men cast suspicious glances at neighbors they'd known for years. The sense of community in those narrow streets fractured, as if everyone had been forced to admit what they already suspected. That danger doesn't come from shadows. It comes from faces you recognize. The Ripper changed policing forever, though not in the ways you'd hope. Scotland Yard adopted new methods, criminal profiling, better record-keeping, even primitive forensics, but the reforms were built on failure. They weren't innovations born of genius. They were desperate bandages slapped onto a gaping wound. Fingerprinting, blood analysis, psychological study. These things came later, too late for the women already gutted in alleys. The case also warped the media. Newspapers realized murder wasn't just news. It was entertainment. The Ripper became their best-selling serial. Broadsheets ran gruesome illustrations, mocking poems, and speculative theories that blurred fact and fiction until readers couldn't tell them apart. Sensational crime coverage became the template for tabloid culture, the ancestor of every lurid headline we scroll past today. And the victims? They were written out of their own story. Their lives compressed into footnotes, their humanity dissolved into shorthand. 5 prostitutes. Never mind that not all of them were sex workers. Never mind their children, their illnesses, their struggles. The Ripper devoured not just their bodies, but their identities. History remembers his name. Theirs are recited like a grim roll call, rarely with faces attached. Culturally, the murders metastasized into myth. Jack the Ripper became a kind of folk demon, invoked in penny dreadfuls, novels, plays, and films. He was transformed into a puzzle, a character, even an antihero. The fact that he was never caught allowed everyone to project their fears onto him. The foreigner, the doctor, the aristocrat, the madman, the everyman. He was whatever society feared most at the time, a mirror in the fog. And that's the real legacy. A city forced to confront itself. The Ripper revealed the hypocrisy of Victorian morality, that women were left to starve on the streets, while their murders drew more outrage than their lives ever did. He exposed the failures of the police, the cruelty of poverty, the voyeurism of the press. He wasn't just a killer. He was a symptom, a disease London pretended it didn't have until it started coughing blood. The aftermath wasn't closure. It was infection, and the wound has never fully healed. Picture the scene one last time. A foggy street, a body cooling in the shadows, a knife flashing somewhere just out of sight. Then nothing. No footsteps, no silhouette slipping away. Just silence. That silence has lasted more than a century, longer than empires, longer than the gas lamps that once flickered above the blood. We still call him Jack, as if naming the Phantom makes him less terrifying. But names are lies. They turn chaos into something you can fold neatly into a newspaper column. The truth is harder to swallow. We don't know who he was, what he wanted, or why he stopped. And that ignorance gnaws at us because it reminds us how fragile our illusions of control really are. If a city like